$10 million. How can it turn a man's entire life upside down in a single moment? The story begins not in a quiet village, but in a glass-walled boardroom high above the city, where power, money, and ambition collide every second. Jack stood at the head of the long conference table, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His expression calm but his eyes carrying a storm no one in the room could read. Around him sat dozens of shareholders, executives, and advisors, people who had built an empire with him, people who believed they knew exactly who Jack was. But in the next few seconds, everything they thought they knew would shatter. "I'm stepping down as CEO," Jack said, his voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. For a moment, no one reacted. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then whispers erupted, chairs shifted, and disbelief spread across every face in the room. At the far end of the table, a woman slammed her hand down so hard that the sound echoed sharply against the glass walls. That woman was Halan, Jack's mother, the true power behind the corporation. A woman who had spent her entire life climbing to the top and ensuring her son would never fall from it. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice trembling not with weakness, but with fury barely contained. "You're throwing everything away? For what? For that girl?" Jack didn't flinch. He had expected this. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but standing here, facing the weight of his past, it still felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. "Her name is Tu Tien," he replied quietly but firmly. "And yes, for her." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't shock, it was tension, thick and suffocating. Halan's eyes burned with disbelief, then hardened into something colder, sharper. "She is nothing," she said. "A poor girl from some remote mountain village. She will destroy everything you've built. Everything I've built for you." Jack let out a slow breath. For years he had lived under expectations, under pressure, under a version of success that never truly belonged to him. Money, power, influence, he had all of it. Yet none of it had ever made him feel alive. Not until he met Tu Tien. One afternoon under the harsh sun, Jack was making his usual deliveries when he noticed a small figure collapsed by the side of the road. He immediately stopped, rushing over. It was a little girl, thin, pale, clutching a stack of lottery tickets in her small hands. "Hey, are you okay?" Jack asked, gently lifting her up. The girl barely opened her eyes. I haven't eaten," she whispered weakly. Jack's chest tightened. Without hesitation, he carried her to the nearest stall, bought her food, and waited until she regained some strength. When she finally sat up, she looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "Please, can you buy some tickets?" she asked, holding them out with trembling hands. "If I don't sell them, I can't go home." Jack reached into his pocket. He knew exactly how much money he had left. It wasn't much, just enough to get through the next few days. For a brief second he hesitated, not because he didn't want to help, but because reality pressed hard against his decision. Then he looked at her again, and the hesitation disappeared. "I'll take all of them," he said. Mi's eyes widened in shock. All of them?" Jack nodded, handing over the last of his money. "All of them." That night, back in the small wooden house he shared with Tu Tien, Jack casually placed the stack of tickets on the table, not thinking much about it. To him, it wasn't an investment. It was simply an act of kindness. Tu Tien looked at the tickets, then at him. "You used all your money for this?" Jack chuckled lightly. "It's okay. We'll figure something out." But later that evening, as the radio crackled softly in the background, announcing the winning numbers, something strange happened. Jack wasn't even paying attention at first, until one number sounded familiar. Then another, and another. Slowly, almost unwillingly, he reached for one of the tickets. His hands froze. "No way," he whispered. Tu Tien turned toward him. "What is it?" Jack didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the numbers again and again, as if hoping they would change. But they didn't. He had matched every single number. This can't be real," he said, his voice barely audible. Tu Tien stepped closer, her heart pounding as she looked at the ticket. The moment she realized what it meant, her breath caught in her throat. "Jack, this is $10 million, he finished. Silence filled the room, heavier than anything they had ever experienced. Outside, the village remained quiet, unaware that inside this small wooden house, fate had just shifted in the most unimaginable way. Jack stared at the ticket, his mind racing, his past and present colliding in a single moment. Tu Tien, however, wasn't smiling, because deep down she knew this money wouldn't just change their lives. It would test them, it would challenge them, and it might take everything away again. $10 million. How can it continue to change everything when the shock has barely settled and reality begins to take shape in ways no one expects? The small wooden house, once filled with simple laughter and quiet peace, now felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened under the weight of what had just happened. Jack still stood frozen, the lottery ticket trembling slightly in his hand, while Tu Tien remained silent, her eyes fixed not on the money, but on him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside remained unchanged. Distant voices, the sound of wind brushing against the bamboo walls, the faint hum of life in the village. But inside that room, everything had shifted. "Say something." Jack finally broke the silence, his voice uncertain in a way it had never been before. We just won $10 million. Tu Tien slowly sat down, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "You won $10 million. Jack frowned. "What do you mean, I? This is ours." She shook her head gently. "That's exactly what scares me." Jack didn't understand at first. To him, this was a miracle, an unexpected reward for a simple act of kindness. A second chance, maybe even a better one than before. But to Tu Tien, this felt like the beginning of something dangerous. "You left everything to come here," she continued, her voice calm but heavy. "You left money, power, that life. And now it found you again. Don't you think that means something?" Jack looked down at the ticket again. He had spent years chasing success, building an empire, becoming someone people respected or feared. And then he had walked away from it all, believing that freedom and love were more important than wealth. But now, standing here with $10 million in his hand, he couldn't deny the feeling rising inside him. Possibility. "We can do so much with this," he said, stepping closer to her. "We can fix the roads here, build better homes, help everyone in the village. No one has to struggle anymore." Tu Tien looked at him carefully. "Or we can lose everything again." Jack's expression tightened. "You don't trust me?" "I do," she replied immediately. "But I don't trust what money does to people." That sentence hit harder than anything his mother had ever said. Jack turned away slightly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not the same person I was before." "I know," Tu Tien said. "But money doesn't care who you were. It changes who you become." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried tension, not shock. That night, neither of them slept much. Jack lay awake staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with ideas, plans, possibilities. Every instinct he had built as a CEO began to resurface, calculating, strategizing, seeing opportunities everywhere. He hated to admit it, but it felt familiar. Almost too familiar. Meanwhile, Tu Tien sat by the window, watching the darkness outside slowly fade into dawn. She wasn't thinking about what they could gain, but what they might lose. By morning, the news had already begun to spread. First, it was just whispers. A delivery boy had suddenly come into money. Then the whispers turned into conversations. And by midday, the entire village knew. People started showing up at their door. Curious, excited, hopeful. Some came to congratulate, others came with requests, and a few came simply to see if the story was true. "Jack, is it real?" one man asked, eyes wide. "You really won $10 million? Jack hesitated for a second, then nodded. The reaction was immediate. Cheers, laughter, disbelief. For the villagers, this wasn't just Jack's fortune. It felt like hope had arrived in their forgotten world. But not everyone reacted the same way. Truong Thon Pao stood at a distance, watching quietly, his expression thoughtful. He had seen enough in his life to know that sudden wealth never came without consequences. Later that day, an unfamiliar car appeared at the entrance of the village, sleek, black, completely out of place among the dusty roads and wooden houses. It stopped slowly and the door opened. A woman stepped out. Elegant, composed, powerful. Ha Lan. Jack froze the moment he saw her. "I knew it wouldn't take long," she said calmly as she walked toward him. her heels clicking sharply against the ground. $10 million, fate really does have a sense of humor. Tu Tien instinctively stepped closer to Jack, her presence quiet but firm. What are you doing here? Jack asked, his voice cold.
Hạ Lan sợ Mai Phai Ly.
I came to see my son. Or is that not allowed anymore? You lost that right when you tried to control my life, Jack replied. Her eyes flickered slightly, but she didn't lose her composure. Instead, she turned her gaze to Tu Tien, scanning her from head to toe. So, this is the girl who made you throw everything away.
Tử Tiên Điên Tờ Red Pawn.
She simply met Ha Lan's gaze without fear. Ha Lan let out a soft laugh. Interesting. Then she turned back to Jack. You think this money is a blessing? She asked. No, it's a test, and you're not ready for it. I don't need your advice, Jack said sharply. No, she agreed. But you will need my help. Jack clenched his jaw. I'm not going back. I'm not asking you to, she replied. I'm offering you something better. Jack didn't trust her, not even for a second, but something in her tone made him pause. $10 million is nothing, Ha Lan continued. Not in the real world. Not if you don't know how to protect it, grow it, control it.
Tử Tiên S Persino Titan.
She could feel it, the shift, the pull, the invisible line forming again between two worlds. Jack looked at the money, then at his mother, then at Tu Tien. 3 paths, 3 futures, and only one choice. I'll handle it my way, Jack finally said. Ha Lan smiled again, but this time there was something colder behind it. We'll see. As she turned and walked back to her car, the tension she left behind lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jack stood there, silent. Tu Tien looked at him, her voice soft but filled with meaning. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Jack didn't answer, because deep down, he knew she was right.